Hey folks, today I want to talk about updating your website and keeping your website up to date and why that is a good thing, and how we can maybe help you do that. So what do I mean by website updates? So what I mean is not so much like your content or your images of your website or anything like that. It's more about the stuff that your website needs to run well. So that might be the sort of the framework that the website is built in. So it might be like WordPress or Ruby on Rails, things like that. It might be the tools that your website uses a lot. So, for example, plugins, or like in Ruby, we'd call them gems, like the dependencies of your code. It might be the server itself that the website sits on. So, you have your website. It has to be hosted somewhere. So it's sometimes called a web server, your web host, like that sort of thing there. And then there's also the services that your website interacts with. So that might be, your database, that might be your analytics packages, or like sort of APIs that your website or your web app uses. So these are all sort of those four things are things that could be updatable. And that's what we mean by sort of website or web app updates. I think there's 5 reasons for keeping your website up to date. The first is security. So it allows you to patch security vulnerabilities, which will hopefully keep you more secure. There's often performance improvements to be had by keeping things up to date. So often a lot of updates will address performance issues, which is always a good thing. Keeping things up to date means that you can always use sort of the latest and greatest bits of the service that you're using. So often new versions of software will sort of only have features that are enabled if your website has the latest version of that code on it, which again is an important thing to have. So you're making full use out of your services. By updating regularly, you will reduce the amount of overhead it takes to do bigger updates. So often what happens with dev teams is they put off doing an update until the last possible moment, and they realize, oh flip, we need to update it in order for us to ship the feature that we're currently working on. And it's a massive undertaking to go through and update all the different versions from where you're at to where you need to be. Whereas if you were doing it as you were going along, it's a much smaller task each time. And finally, it helps to keep your developers and your sort of web team productive, because if you have too many older dependencies and too many, like your website's running on older stuff, it can make it quite hard to make changes to that, because all the documentation is, for all the new stuff, any sort of support you're getting will assume you're running the latest version of anything. It's kind of like whenever you go to look for support on your anything to do with your phone. Say the very first thing is make sure you've got the latest version of the operating system, like that, but for everything your developer is doing. So how do you know if your website needs these updates? Because these are all things that sort of happen behind the scenes, right? Like you wouldn't know just by looking at your website whether it's running an old version of something. And really, it depends based on the setup and the sort of the languages and the frameworks and all that sort of stuff that the web app or website is written in. So, for example, if you had a WordPress website, you could go into the admin area, so just log in, and it would have things to say, oh, these plugins are out of date, this version of WordPress is out of date, here's how you can update it. If it was Ruby on Rails, you would need to ask your development team, and they can run a command and it will tell them all of the dependencies that are out of date. When it comes to things like your servers and your hosts, again, it'll depend very much on the host. Some hosts are very much sort of what they call fully managed, where they look after all of the updates and stuff like that for you. And some are just like, they just give you a computer basically and have at it. And there's a big sort of, everything in between. So it kind of depends, and ditto for services. It kind of depends on the service you're using, how you would find out whether an update's needed or not. For both servers and services, I find being on email lists is good. You'll get an email to say if there's a thing, and If you ever receive an email that you don't fully understand, if you forward it on to your tech team or just reply to the email and say, I don't know if this applies to us, someone can help with that. So yeah, so let's assume you're on board with the idea of keeping your website up to date. How do you actually sort of do that? And this will, like, every team will have a different way of doing this. The way we like to do it is first of all, we set aside time to think about doing this. So we schedule in that we are going to be doing updates. Then we decide which updates are worth doing. So we'll prioritize security updates or things that, offer us more sort of benefit than some that maybe don't. And that will be a case-by-case basis. You have to really understand what the update's doing, and that just takes time to sort of read through the changes and stuff like that. We'll then test all of those updates. So, we'll make sure it works sort of on our computer, make sure it's on staging and working, and then, deploy it to production, test it that way. And once everything's updated and put live, just continue to test and monitor and make sure that's it. And out of those 4 things, I think the hardest is setting aside the time, because once you've decided to do that, and once that's sort of part of the culture of the team, then that'll happen more often. And a lot of the other, like the actual testing and deciding which updates to do, that's a pretty easy thing. It's more the cultural shift of deciding that we're going to make time to do this. And this is kind of where we come in, because this isn't glamorous work. This is boring nuts and bolts, keeping the website ticking over type work, which I appreciate a lot of developers don't want to do. And even ones that do want to do it and they're brought in, they just don't have the time, because their time is better spent on feature development or, supporting customers and all that sort of really important good stuff. So if you've been interested by this video and want to see if your website needs to be brought up to date and what that might entail, but don't have the capacity to do that, do get in touch, because we might be able to help. If it's not, if your setup isn't one that we feel we'd be able to be best placed to help, we will certainly, guide and maybe share some potential next steps with you. And if we are in a position where we could help, we can chat more and see how that goes. So yeah, feel free to drop a comment in the video, or I'll put some links to contact details on our website and stuff where you can learn more. But hopefully this video was useful, and we'll chat soon. Cheers.